Welcome to Politically Basic. I'm your host, Kyle Campbell. With me today on the show is a legend in modern American politics, Jenny Beth Martin, co-founder of the Tea Party and the honorary chairman of Tea Party Patriots Action. Under her leadership, Tea Party Patriots has grown to be the largest and most effective national umbrella group within the Tea Party movement and works to reach millions of Americans every week with education and updates about fiscal responsibility, free market principles, and constitutionally limited government. Jenny Beth Martin is a frequent guest on almost every major news outlet in America. And in 2010, Time magazine listed Jenny Beth Martin as one of the 100 most influential leaders in the world. Her first book, Tea Party Patriots, The Second American Revolution, was published in 2012. A lifelong Georgian, University of Georgia alum, mother to boy-girl twins, that is living the mom life dream right there. Advocate, educator, revolutionary, and total patriot. Madam Chairman, thank you so much for being with me on Politically Basic today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So, Jenny Beth, you essentially co-founded one of the most successful and largest political movements that kind of took hold of a major political party. How did that come about? How did that happen? It was incredibly successful. Tell us a little bit about how that all came about.
Well, you've got to go back a little bit in time to 2009, shortly after Obama was elected president, and then even before that in 2008. So in 2008, George W. Bush was president, and we had the stimulus bill and bank bailouts and the bailout of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And when the TARP passed, which was the Troubled Asset Relief Program, people in the county where I live were so frustrated because they saw that John McCain, who was then senator, and then Senator Barack Obama voted exactly the same way on that bill. And I was the county campaign chairman for the McCain-Palin campaign and the Saxby-Chambliss campaign in the county where I lived. People would take their bumper stickers with McCain Palin and cut off McCain and just put Palin on their car. They were so frustrated with it. And then in 2009, after Obama became president, he moved through and he passed another bailout. It was a stimulus bill, and or maybe not a bailout, but more government spending. So he was passing the stimulus bill. And Rick Santelli, who is a commentator on CNBC, had a rant on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. He complained about the bill. He said our founding fathers would be turning over in their graves, and we needed to have a tea party just like our founding fathers. That rant went viral. Rush Limbaugh was playing it. Other radio stations were playing it. It was on the then emerging social media network Twitter, and I heard it and decided I have to have a tea party. I have no idea how to do this, but I'm going to have a tea party. Well, the day after that rant, Michael Patrick Leahy, who now works for the Tennessee Star Network, owns the Tennessee Star Network. He organized a conference call, and about 22 or so of us got on this conference call the very next day, and we planned to have tea parties a week later. And we wound up having 48 tea parties with 35,000 people in attendance a week after that rant. And then 6 weeks later, we had tax day tea parties, and there were over 850 of those tax day tea parties with more than 1.2 million people attending across the country.
That is absolutely amazing. The energy, the turnout. Tell me what went on when you say you had a tea party.
Well, it was really funny because it's funny because I knew nothing about how to organize a protest. I had been involved in politics and organized campaign events and in meetings, but I'd never done a protest. So we get to the first one in Atlanta, and it was at our state capitol. CNN showed up because the headquarters of CNN was nearby, and a local Fox person who worked in Atlanta, but for Fox, the national network, showed up as well. And it was pouring down rain, and everyone had umbrellas, and I didn't even get a sound system. We didn't even think that we would need a microphone and speakers so that people could hear us. We wound up with nearly 500 people there that day. It was way more than what we had imagined. I don't even know that we knew how many to expect, but it was a huge crowd. Pouring down rain in February. It was probably hovering around 39, 40 degrees. So that is cold, damp day. And we had some speeches. And then the next time on tax day, we realized we've got to make sure that we've got a sound system. So we had a sound system, and it wound up being much bigger. The one that we had on tax day, Sean Hannity wound up coming to Atlanta, did his show from right next to our Tax Day Tea Party event. And there were more people at that event than the Capitol Police had ever seen. They knew that we had over 20,000 people who attended. And after that, they said they could no longer count the crowd size because they didn't know how to gauge it. But we had a sound system, so if you're near the front, you could hear. We did not have enough to go way far, several blocks down the street. And then what we wound up doing later that year in September, we had the Taxpayer March on Washington on September 12th, and there were 1.5 million people at that event. And by then, we learned you need to have signs. You've got to have signs with your messaging. Keep the messaging very similar. Chants are a good thing. When you're doing a long event outside, keep the speeches really short and pithy so that the energy stays high and people don't get hot and frustrated and leave. So we learned a lot from February to September really quickly.
So no actual tea went into any literal body of water.
At our event, they did not. There were a few places where people did things with tea and tea bags, especially in those first two tea parties, because Rick Santelli said we need to have a tea party like our founding fathers. So they were trying to emulate some of that. And in fact, I think in Boston, they poured tea into the water in Boston.
Yeah, but this kicked off a real true movement. And it sounds like you didn't even realize what an impact you were having and what was starting in that moment. What was your reaction to all that, and how did it grow from there?
Well, you're right. As it began, especially in on the very first event, we had no idea what to expect. You know, we're getting on these conference calls. It's strangers from all over the country who are organizing these events. And there were two other people in Atlanta who were on the call. Amy Kramer, who just got elected to the Republican National Committee from Georgia, and Debbie Dooley. And we organized this event, and the first time we saw each other was the day of the first Tea Party in front of the Capitol. So you're getting to know other people. And then as we went to that second round for tax day tea parties, we could tell it was growing very large because more and more people were signing up to hold events. And then the more people that signed up to hold events, the more people heard about it. And so it really just wound up going viral. And Rick Santelli's rant went viral. And it's really important to understand this is before everything goes viral now. Like on TikTok, every minute somebody new is going viral with something, and it's spreading like wildfire across the internet. But in 2009, that just did not happen very often. And so it grew, and we were constantly for a couple of years just doing everything we could to keep up with the crowd and help support the people who were part of the Tea Party movement the very best we could. Instead of thinking, hey, I'm going to create a business plan and raise money and then hope that I do something that attracts people were there, and then we had to go back and create structure to support them.
It's just amazing to think about. And you're so right. That was before there was so much content out there, right? And so people were finding you, they were hearing about you and what the Tea Party movement stood for. I mean, this was a time of extreme frustration, similar to the actual Boston Tea Party in 1773, when patriots were just feeling the oppression of King George III, who was a total tyrant. There's so many parallels to what was going on then, and even what was going on during this time when you started the Tea Party Patriot movement. Do you think that we are approaching a time again, or that we're living in a time now, Jenny Beth, where people are starting to kind of ramp up that frustration, that feeling of oppression, those feelings that leadership in politics, in our government, is not hearing the American people. They're lying to the American people. Do you think that that is ramping up again? And are we poised for another time of a movement similar to Tea Party Patriots being created again?
Well, I think that the movement that exists right now that harnesses most of that energy is the Make America Great Again movement, the MAGA movement, and people who support President Trump. I think that a few things have happened from 2009 to where we are today. In 2009, we were really angry, and we're angry about the spending. And as all of this was happening and people were frustrated about spending, step back for just a moment and remember where we were. We were in a recession. People were losing their homes across the country. So we saw neighbors who were losing their homes. And in fact, my then husband and I had gone through bankruptcy. When we were looking for a rental home after our bankruptcy, we got a call from our mortgage company saying we could stay in our house with some Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac loan that would bring us current in our mortgage, and then we could stay in the house. And we were opposed to those bailouts. Even in the midst of all of the personal financial trouble we were going through, we were opposed to those bailouts. So when we got that call, we couldn't take that money. And we just were like, no, we were opposed to that. It's wrong. We just went through bankruptcy. Who gives someone who went through bankruptcy a loan anyway? Nobody in their right mind does. Oh, the federal government does. Again, no one in their right mind does that. You've got to let people rebuild and rebuild the trust to give money again. So we did not do that, and we were starting over as this entire movement began. And one of the things that Rick Santelli said in that first rant that he had, when he was yelling and complaining about the stimulus bill, he said to the people standing behind him, "Who here wants to pay for your neighbors' homes that have more bathrooms than you, and they can no longer afford to pay for it?" And the people on the floor of the Mercantile Exchange were yelling, "Boo, boo, no." Well, my then husband and I were actually cleaning our neighbors' homes and cleaning their bathrooms rather than them bailing us out. And so that's part of what motivated me to want us to have this Tea Party, because I was like, yeah, this money is wrong. We have to stop with this kind of spending. And there was an anger. Well, what happened then, the Tea Party movement wound up being targeted by the IRS. And then President Trump became president, and we saw the things that the FBI and the CIA were doing to him to undermine his presidency before he became president with Russia, Russia, Russia. So you mentioned in 1773, there was this awful tyrant and oppression. I think in 2009, 2010, we were angry and we felt like the spending was wrong. And we were really, really angry and hot under the collar. But now it's not just being angry. There is a sense of real oppression and a sense of tyranny. And we're watching as the president right now is literally helping put his chief political opponent in prison. So it's a much different time right now than it was in 2008. There's similarities, or 2009. There's similarities, but the sense of tyranny is much stronger today than it was before. And even though it is, and people are really upset, I think that the best way we can make a difference this year is to make sure we're doing everything we can to secure elections and then to win elections so that we can right the things that are going wrong politically in the country.
You said that the MAGA movement was really kind of born out of the Tea Party Patriot movement. But Tea Party Patriots still exists, and you guys are doing great work. Can you tell me a little bit about that work and sort of the status of the Tea Party today?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's important to understand we still do a lot. And then what happens with the MAGA movement, it is an incredible movement as well. And we do share a lot of similarities. And I think that most of the people who support our organization also support President Trump. Like I would say 99% do. So what we do today and what we did from the very beginning, we have three core values: personal freedom, economic freedom, and a debt-free future. And we continue to do everything that we can, especially in off-election years when Congress is passing a lot of laws, to educate our supporters on what laws are being passed, to determine the best stance that we think should be taken on any given bill, and then make phone calls, write letters to the editor, educate our fellow Americans, and try to get Congress to pass the right kind of legislation. Then during election years, we do two things now. We have for several years worked on getting out the vote for candidates who support our values. But the other thing that we've done since 2020 is that we really are focusing on educating people about how to become poll watchers and making sure they know how to get plugged into their local political party so that they can watch the polls and make sure that the laws are being followed as individual citizens are entitled to do legally, because we wind up providing a check and balance on the election system by having those eyes and ears inside the polling places. So we're really doing a lot on that, and we didn't do that quite so much before 2020. We encouraged people to be poll watchers and poll workers before 2020, and then told them they needed to go get involved with the local political party. But since then, we've done a lot more to recruit people, actively working on that, and then educate them so they know how and what to do specifically when they are reaching out to their local parties to become poll watchers. We were very active in the speaker race in 2023, just last year. So in January, as the House Freedom Caucus was opposed to Kevin McCarthy initially, and were really being opposed to him because they wanted rules changes in the House of Representatives, we were working to educate people about what those rules changes were and why they were important, and why the vote for speaker could be used as leverage to get those rules changes. And then when the motion to vacate actually happened and passed, and McCarthy was no longer speaker, we were working very hard on supporting the various people who we thought should become speaker. And ultimately, it wound up being Mike Johnson. And he has a much different relationship with the Tea Party and even with the conservative movement more broadly than what I've seen any other speaker have. His office, they're not always doing everything that I want. His votes are not always what I would want a congressman to vote, but he is at least reaching out and has the communication open. And his job's different than the average member of Congress because he's the Speaker of the House. So he's got to bring together all the factions. And so we really support the House Freedom Caucus, but we do understand and respect what the Speaker is doing as well.
Yeah, let me ask you about that quickly. I'm glad that you're bringing that up. And it sounds like you guys are doing so much good work, and I really commend you on the many, many things that you're doing. When we saw the speakership change, we had Kevin McCarthy, and then there was a shift, which ended in Mike Johnson assuming that position. There was a lot of confusion amongst the American people about what that was and what was happening. And so being politically basic, I just like to really break things down for people, because I think that was one of the more confusing political changes that happened in recent history for us. And maybe you can explain to me, to my listeners, a little bit about what went down there. It seemed like there was a lot of negotiating going on. Republicans were voting, and it became very difficult at the end of the day to get the votes for Kevin McCarthy. There was a lot of horse trading going on and phones being swapped and secret side conversations. What was going on there? And maybe you can help us understand a little bit better just how that process works. What's being negotiated, and how does that affect who is ultimately voted in as Speaker of the House?
Okay, so let's go back to January 1st, because and then we can go to when the speakership was actually vacated. But in January, there was a block of people in the House Freedom, mostly members of the House Freedom Caucus, who kept voting against Kevin McCarthy. So they were voting for other members, and Kevin McCarthy had to have a majority of votes on the floor of the House to become Speaker. And they kept not voting for him. Now, it appeared at one point it was hard to tell whether they were going to bend and go ahead and vote for him or not. And there were a couple of things going on. One, some of those people felt like they just couldn't trust Kevin McCarthy, and the trust had been so severely breached that created a real problem for him when it was such a narrow margin. There were just a few votes difference between the House and the Senate, or between the Republicans and the Democrats. So he had to have pretty much every single vote. And there were a few people who just did not trust him. But you set aside the few people who did not trust him, the other members of the House Freedom Caucus were working very hard to get rules changes in place. And they wanted changes to the Rules Committee. They wanted to make sure that they had some of their people on key committees like the Appropriation Committee. They wanted full debate and the full amendment process to happen from the floor of the chamber, which initially was committed to, but that hasn't actually panned out. And they were working really hard to improve and strengthen the way that the House would function and to try to make it more functional. That was the effort and the goal. And when he had such a small, thin majority, they were able to bind together and use their votes as leverage to push those changes. And in the end, McCarthy agreed to their changes to the rules. And he devolved some of the power from the Speaker back to the body, which I think is a good thing. And that de-evolution of power has continued with Mike Johnson in office. So that was a good thing. So then after all of these votes, I think at first he thought, I don't know because I didn't speak to him, but I would imagine he thought, oh, they're going to cave after a few votes because we'll just put pressure on them and we'll have all the networks calling them out and we'll just do everything we can to put pressure on them and they'll have to cave and vote the way we want. But the House Freedom Caucus felt so strongly about the changes that needed to happen that they were not going to budge until they got the changes made. And eventually, McCarthy realized that he was going to have to make those changes in order to get their vote, and that's what happened. So then he goes on and he is Speaker, but as he was Speaker, he violated some of the promises that he had made to the members, and a few of them were very bothered by this. This is in September as the spending bill was being passed. And so they wound up moving to vacate him. And that means that it's a privilege motion. So once they offered that motion, it had to be voted on the floor of the House when they offered it as a privilege motion. And only one member right now. And since Thomas Jefferson, it has always been only one member can make that kind of motion, except for when Speaker Pelosi became Speaker and she increased the number. And I think that it was very risky for McCarthy to turn it back to one member, but I think he did the right thing, and that's how it should have been handled. So one member did, and it never really been done before. They wound up removing him as Speaker of the House. And then once he was removed, they had to get a new Speaker. And so it went through all of those votes where you had to have basically unanimity among the Republicans in order to get a Speaker. And at first, Steve Scalise was the first one who got the majority vote in conference. So he took it to the floor of the House, but he did not have unanimous support on the floor of the House. So he removed his name, and he was the next in line. So it would have kind of made sense based on the way politics worked before for the next in line to just move on up the pecking order. And then Jim Jordan tried, and then a few other people were trying, and they just kept going down this list. And eventually, Mike Johnson's name came up, and he wound up getting the votes, and he became the Speaker. And then since then, there's been one more vote to try to remove him, but that failed. And I think at that point, whether you like how he was doing or not, that failing, especially in the middle of an election year, was the right thing. There's a time and a place for everything, and votes on speaker and floor battles in the House about who's going to be the speaker makes sense in a not election year. But as you move into an election year, it's much more difficult to get the base engaged on a fight like that when they're working on elections locally and at a state level. Their attention just becomes consumed with elections. And so I think that any challenges like that need to wait until the next Congress.
Yeah. Wow. Politics is complicated.
It is.
We don't always know, the average everyday American citizen doesn't always know what is happening behind the scenes. So thank you so much for breaking that down and explaining that to us. And it does seem that Mike Johnson's speakership maybe had a little bit of a bumpy start, and perhaps you can attribute that to what had just happened with McCarthy. But it does seem like things are evening out for him, and he is showing some clear-headed strength and leadership.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember Scalise was the next one in line, and then they tried to get Jim Jordan. And so they're moving down this pecking order. He wasn't even really in the pecking order. He was much further down.
Jenny Beth, nobody knew that he was in Congress.
Yeah, exactly.
Everyone was like, who's Mike Johnson?
Right. Most people did not know who he was at all. And under normal circumstances, you win an election in November and you become speaker in January. So you've got almost 8 weeks to get your staff up to speed, to have a transition from one speaker to the next. He basically figured it out one night, became speaker the next day, and the staff was he didn't have that same grace period that most other speakers have. So people, yeah, of course you're going to be off to a bumpy start because you've got massive important legislation that has to pass. Israel was being attacked, and then on top of that, you're trying to get staff in place and move offices and make sure that you know how to be speaker and get all the different briefings that the Speaker of the House, who's third in line to the president, winds up needing. So you have to have a little bit of grace in that time period. And I think some people did, and I think others did not, because everybody wants change and we all want it right this second. And I'm guilty of that myself, but I also understand I'm not going to get everything I want. And so you've got to just look and go, if I were in his shoes, what would I need? Well, I think that if I were in his shoes, what I would need is a few weeks to get my feet underneath me before I can hit the ground running.
Absolutely. A lot of the work that you do has to do with advocating and influencing for the best legislation possible. And we were chatting before about what is happening with legislation regarding the border, our southern border particularly. And I'd love to chat about that with you just for a second, because I know you're so knowledgeable about this. Now, we've seen things absolutely devolve at the southern border. A lot of negotiating going on between Republicans and Democrats, particularly in the House, and a sitting president who has been slow to take executive action, which he has done just recently, to change the way that foreign nationals can come in and seek asylum, or that limit the number of illegal immigrants or immigrants who come across the southern border each day. That has been in effect now for at least a couple of weeks, if not a few weeks, and yet a lot of talk about nothing changing. What is your take? What is your insight and opinion on what's happening at the southern border, particularly since President Biden has just taken executive action on that?
I've been working on the border issue for years. We did a documentary about the border back in 2014. I have visited the border every 10 to 18 months since then. So sometimes it's more frequently, and other times it's a little bit of time in between. The last time I was there was in February. To be very clear, under President Trump, the border was in much better shape than what we've seen in many years, because he was enforcing the law and he was working to build a wall, and he was sending a message to the rest of the world that you have to come to America through legal channels. We're not going to allow you to come into our country illegally. When Biden became president, he signed an executive order on day one, undoing things that President Trump had done through executive order. So he got rid of Remain in Mexico. He stopped building the wall. He, instead of detaining people who come here illegally, he is offering them to have asylum and to come back later to go before a judge and just to go ahead and be in our country instead of detaining them until they actually go before a judge and they decide whether they should be here or not. Those are three things that he undid. He also undid Title 42, which related to COVID, and that was preventing people from coming. But because it was related to a health emergency, that one is more difficult to put back in place because it was related to a healthcare emergency. But he created this problem. No laws changed, no legislation passed. It is what he did himself on day one. And so we've had this flood of people coming into our country, and they come in, they go through the border, and then they get on airplanes or they get in cars and they go somewhere else across the entire country. And they're moving on to New York and Seattle and San Francisco and California, or Los Angeles and other places in California. But they're also moving into Chicago and Atlanta and Iowa and everywhere in the heartland and Alaska. They're moving all over the country. It's not just the major cities, and it's not just the major sanctuary cities. But these sanctuary cities, like in New York City, are feeling the burden of what happens when you have a wide open border. And when you say to the world, hey, come on in, the laws don't matter. If you want to be in America, it doesn't matter whether we have enough room, whether our law says you can or not, whether our system can handle it all. You can come on in and we're letting you in no matter what. And when you've got mayors and governors who say, and when you come, we'll give you sanctuary if you're here illegally, people listen to that. And that is what has happened. And it has been a massive flood of people coming into our country over the last 3.5 years. And that flood winds up creating a situation where people can be exploited and abused. And oftentimes that gets overlooked because they have to pay money to the drug cartels in order to get through Mexico to get to America. And when they owe that money, if they still owe the money when they come into America, then once they get into America, they wind up becoming what we would think of as indentured servants, because they owe so much money back to the people who got them through the country that as they're working, they're still having to pay all of that off. And they don't quite have the same kind of freedom that we think of in America, but Americans just aren't, it's hard to fathom that if you've grown up in America and you've never been in that kind of situation. It's hard to understand that's happening until you talk to sheriffs and border patrols and they explain the situation to you. And then we also are not doing background checks. And even when people are being arrested and detained because maybe they're breaking the law further inland in the country, they're still being released. And then when that kind of thing happens, we see the tragic, senseless, preventable murders that we have seen happen. The county that I'm in right now, Lakin Riley was from this county. Her first grade teacher was the same first grade teacher as my twins. She was a year older than them, so I didn't know her. We did not know her, but many people in my community did. And it hit very close to home because she was murdered by someone who was here illegally, contrary to United States law under Biden. And then we've seen this happen again just this past week with the murder of, I think, a 14-year-old girl. And then another situation where there were 5 men from different countries who were arrested because they had another teenage girl who they were trying to move through the country. I don't even know what they were trying to do to her, but they were arrested. So we're seeing more and more and more of these horrific crimes happening to people in our country who are citizens in our country. And if the people who were here lawlessly were not here, those crimes would never even have the opportunity to be committed.
It's absolutely infuriating to see what is happening, because this situation with the rise, a significant rise in illegal immigration, isn't good for anyone. It's not like these people's lives are being benefited. And you made a really interesting point, Jenny Beth, that the second that they step foot into this country, they're breaking the law. So, of course, why wouldn't they continue to do so? Because they're being rewarded for it. And I think that the frustration and the anger and the devastation that the American people are feeling, I have conversations about this all day long, is that we're seeing these horrific rapes, murders, abductions, sex trafficking, child sex trafficking, which, you know, I have my personal side of my work is in, and my efforts there. And I know a lot about it. And it is the most infuriating thing that not only are we not talking about it as a nation, I mean, these are our kids, and they're foreign nationals' kids. Okay, so if we're not even going to take care of our own kids, we're going to focus on the immigrants. We're not even protecting their children or those children coming across the border. But we're not talking about it as a nation. And we see these horrific, murders happen, and these beatings and these rapes. And there is outrage for a moment, and then the news cycle continues, and we just keep on living. And I think that is what is building right now. So much pain and upset and frustration. So I think you made some excellent points there. And my question to you is, what do we do? What do we do about this? I have so many questions for you about what's going to happen, but it underscores the absolute need to vote. But you took sort of this collective uprising of upset and frustration, and you made it into a movement that was unlike anything that we've seen in our lifetimes. How do we do that again? We've had MAGA for several years now. Yes, they're energized, they're unified, they're angry, there is good energy there, but is it enough?
Well, here's the thing. What we learned in the first couple of years, we were angry and yelling and on the streets. And that is important. It is very important to do, because sometimes that's all that you can do. The most that you can do is just express your anger and frustration with the government through your voice. And it is an important speech and speech that has to happen. Then you've got to figure out, am I just going to complain and be upset, or am I going to do things that can make a difference to solve the problem? And we've worked very hard to find ways to make a difference and solve the problem. And one of the things I didn't mention, we have toolkits available on different issues, and we have meetings in a box. Even like if you have your own group, we have a meeting in a box that we've done once a month this year. We're going to be doing one or two more of those this year, and then we'll pause until next year, but on different issues. The one that is out this month is about defending the Supreme Court. And in it has a guidebook, a how-to guide on how to defend the Supreme Court because they're under attack, and signage that you can use for tabling, and then a PowerPoint presentation that you can use to present to your group. So we work hard to find solutions to the problem. The solution to the problem this year is that it's twofold, and it's kind of a mantra in our organization. It's secure and win. We have to secure elections so that people have faith in the outcome of them, no matter how they turn out. And then we have to win elections so that we get conservatives in office who will do the right thing. And in the case of the border, who will work to pass border security legislation and then cut spending, grow the economy, stop the massive inflation that is going on. And the list goes on and on of the legislative solutions that we want to see happen. Those solutions cannot happen unless we win in November. And no more major legislation is going to pass before, well, there won't be much that passes out of Congress before September 30th or October 1st. That's the end of this fiscal year and the beginning of the next fiscal year. And at that time, I expect that it will be some sort of continuing resolution that goes either a few months into the next presidency, or it may be one that lasts through the first year of the next presidency, which I think would be a problem. I think it should only go a few months. But then in January, you will have a new Congress, and we will hopefully have a new president. And at that point, we've got to make sure we're passing the legislation. But before we can get there and even think about what to do in January, we've got to secure elections, and we've got to get out the vote and win elections. And our super PAC, Tea Party Patriots Citizens Fund, is working on doing just that. And we're innovating how we get out the vote, and in fact trying to catch up with what we've seen the left do in the last several election cycles very, very well with what they call relational organizing, and we're working on that as well.
Jenny Beth, you mentioned some resources for people. Where can we find those?
If you go to our website, teapartypatriots.org, teapartypatriots.org, we have a place where you can get much of the information. We've got the Supreme Court defenders will be up there if it is not up there already, and then one on citizen-only voting, and then getting involved to secure and win. And then if you have a local group, if you actually have a local group and you want to get the meeting in a box that I referenced, if you just shoot me an email, Jenny.Beth, that's JENNY.BETH at teapartypatriots.org. We'll have someone contact you and get all of your contact information so we can get a couple of the meeting in a boxes out to you.
Thank you. Well, I've only got a couple minutes left with you, and I want to ask you a big question. Don't worry, you're going to love it, because I love asking people this question. I'd like you to predict the future. What is going to happen, do you think, between now and November 5th?
Wow, I don't have a crystal ball, so that's really hard. Here's what I know. I think that a lot of people are very, very worried, and they're very concerned about our country. And the most important thing that we can do, I think, is this. Maybe it's two things. Remember, this country that we love so much, and even though things are horrible right now, and they really are bad, and I expect that President Trump is going to be given a prison sentence. I don't know whether they put him in prison before the election, but I expect that we'll probably see that in July. We have to be prepared for the worst, hope for the best. But as we are preparing for the worst, do it in this manner. Remember that our country has survived a civil war and 2 world wars. And there were very, very dark and bleak times in our nation's past, and we got through those times. And we can do that again right now, and we're not at war with one another. And that is a good thing. I don't want to be at war with one another. And we have the power to make a difference. And the way we can make a difference in November is to make sure that we are securing elections, and that we're getting out the vote, and that we win elections. And that is how we just, no matter how bad things get, just keep thinking secure and win, secure and win, secure and win. And if we all are doing that, and we stay laser focused on the 2 things that we have to do in November, then I think that we'll have a good night after election day.
That is very hopeful. Thank you. Because there is bad news. So it's good to know that there is hope on the horizon. Well, Jenny Beth, I can't thank you enough for coming on Politically Basic with me today. You are such a warrior. I know people don't really fully understand all the layers, all of the depth to you. I am very blessed and lucky to know you, better than most who are hearing this. And I think the world of you. And I know that you are working so hard for the health and safety and security of our country. So on behalf of everyone who knows you and who's listening, thank you for all of the work that you're doing. And thank you so much for sharing what you did on the show today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really had a great time chatting with you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of Politically Basic, where we break down the basics of all political issues and let you decide. Be sure to follow us at politicallybasic.com and at Politically Basic on all socials so you don't miss a single episode. See you next time.